Tomorrow I'm going to get fired for a private Facebook post. What's the dumbest reason you've ever been fired? I worked midnights at a steel mill as a very young adult for 2 years. I had access to the entire network to do some of my work, even though I was just a general laborer. Union shop. Long story short, someone had left their login and password in a file on the public directory. I, being the good little worker, pointed it out to my direct supervisor. From there, I thought it was over. Turns out, he took this account that belonged to a wonderful older woman that also happened to have unrestricted access and logged into fetish kink sites at work. He was hardcore busted. What does he do? Points the finger at me and says I'm the one that gave him the password and login. Ballum. Fired for hacking a corporate network. That's what you get for being young. I got fired for turning in my 2-week notice. WorldCom sucked butt anyway. I worked in this costume shop, and my boss, who was obviously very unhappy with her life, had built this place up in her head and acted like we were some designer store on Rodeo Doctor. In my free time I write for a couple of local blogs and magazines, go to events, fashion week and things like that. I always got invites to these events and she never did, and would always say it was because she is too important for them, so people were intimidated to invite her. When I'd work the day after an event, she'd pick on me the entire day and say the event was probably lame and all the people they had to be tacky. She even got in my face and called me a S one day because a guy from one of the events recognized me and said hello while I was working. Finally, after I got an amazing opportunity and got to cover Fashion Week and go for free and everything, I went into work and she told me I was fired. I'd betrayed her. Plus side is I immediately got offered a job at an actual clothing store, with benefits and commission. No more selling pimp and hot dog costumes. I saw a dishwasher at the old restaurant I worked at get fired because one of the cooks at the time got mad and threw a plate across the kitchen. The plate shattered, and seconds after the owner walked in and without any further inquiry fired the person responsible for washing the dishes. I did not begin that story thinking the dishwasher was a person. I was fired from an ice cream shop for not being gay. It turned out the manager was looking to replace a young girl who had been working there before me and who she had been having a lesbian relationship with. I'm having difficulty counting how many ways this is illegal. I was fired last summer from my job managing a pool after almost dying in a chlorinator explosion caused by poor training of another new manager because I lost the pool's door keys while escaping a cloud of chlorine gas. The new manager before me had closed the valves both to and from our chlorine feeder after accidentally putting in too many chlorine pucks, leaving a virtual pipe bomb of slowly dissolving chlorine for me to find the next morning. When I unlocked the door to the pool's pump room, I didn't notice both valves were closed. It is typical to shut the outgoing valve for the night, so I turned off the main pump and went to open the chlorine feeder to put a few pucks in for the day. As soon as I put my hand on the lid to open her up, half of the 12x24 inches feeder exploded upwards, jamming one of my fingers, raining acid, and unleashing a horrible cloud of chlorine gas. Amidst the chaos of lung, eye, and skin burning, I dropped the keys which had been in my hand the whole time. I called my supervisor to tell him what happened. He promptly came to the pool, sympathetic, and installed a new feeder. 2 days later I was called in to meet with the owner of the management company. He told me he was disappointed that I lost the keys to the pool, that I lost them because I was careless, and that if I didn't find them I would not be hired back for the next season. I didn't find them. He never addressed the fact that I could have been killed due to his company's neglect. I was scheduled to work on a Friday and got diagnosed with mono on a Monday. I don't know if you've ever had mono, but it knocks you on your butt pretty hard. I showed my employer my note on Monday and promptly was picked up by my mother and brought home to get taken care of properly. I got a text from my boss on Friday saying that I needed to come in or I was fired. When I reminded him I had mono, he said that my job was to sit at a desk and take to-go orders. I also check to-go orders, which means I have direct contact with people's food. Dumbest crap ever. I slept 14 hours a day when I had mono and could barely function for long enough to take one final at a time. Your boss is a dong. Apparently said GM lost out on his Christmas bonus because too much money had gone missing on his watch, so he was super pissed. So he comes in one night he wasn't working and asks to see this tiny little 18-year-old kid who had just been promoted like 2 weeks prior outside. I was 21 at the time. The other manager was maybe 5 feet 5 inches and 120 pounds soaking wet. About 20 minutes later the GM comes back in rubbing his knuckles and looks me in the eye and says, "Hey, Joker thief, I'm going to need you to clean up some blood." So in shock I go outside and sure enough there is blood all over the back smoking garbage area, and I start to clean it up while he stands and watches me while telling this sap story about his life and money woes and how much the kid deserved it. He then goes home and the rest of the staff and I are just kind of standing there shocked that this just happened. About an hour later the 18-year-old manager comes back and his face is barely recognizable. I told him to go to the hospital, but he refused for whatever reason, and he said he called the cops and asked me to back up his story, which I tell him I would. So another half hour or so passes and then the cops show up at Taco Bell and I give them a statement that is completely truthful. Chatted with the cops for a while, give them some free tacos and then head home for the night. Next day I come into work and the GM asks to see me outside. Now I'm 6 tall and 275 pounds and grew up in a rougher neighborhood, so I'm not some easy target, and was, at that point, almost eager for him to hit me so I can teach him a lesson. He got in my face and it seemed like he was weighing his options, but he decided against it and just asked me if I talked to the cops, to which I replied yes, and I'm surprised he hadn't been arrested already. He then says, "Finish out your shit and don't bother coming back. You're fired." So I said, "Oh heck no. If you're gonna fire me, have the balls to do it in front of everyone." So I walk back inside, ask all the staff that were there to gather around and that the GM has something he'd like to say. So put on the spot he fires me then and there, and I go home to call the labor board to see how badly I can sue their asses for wrongful termination. Turns out I can't. I hadn't worked there long enough and didn't make enough money, which was a real pee-off. I hated that job anyways and I got another one pretty quick, so it wasn't a huge deal, but it still blows my mind, and people rarely believe me when I tell the story. Just for some background, I really love this job. I had been there for over 4 years. I started when I was 16. I started at the bottom and proved to management I was trustworthy. I worked my entire 8+ HR shift by myself most days. Management sent me to deposit money into the bank when we were overflowing with cash. I wrote schedules when the manager needed me to. I was getting bonuses weekly from home office because of my sales customer service. I never cheated. I never stole. And I loved that job. I envisioned myself working there until after I graduated college. Sure, I wasn't being paid jack crap, but they were flexible with my school hours and that's all I really wanted at the time. They closed a store a city over, which my boss wife happened to manage. Due to poor sales, they'd decide to promote my boss to regional and move her over to my store and have her manage it. She's been with the company 15 years. It's cool, whatever. I've met her a couple of times. Within a day of her being there, she starts telling me everything I'm doing wrong. Within 2 days, I'm being written up for the first time ever in 4 years because I clocked in 5 minutes before my shift was supposed to start. My previous manager always had me clock in as soon as I came in so I could get to work on shipment and phone orders. Day 3 rolls around. New manager has girl from her former store come and fill out an application and wants me to show her the ropes of how things work here. Day 4. Old boss, who is now regional manager, catches me before I walk in. Can't look me in the face all during the conversation. Reason for termination: poor sales. I guess I got it lucky. They fired me in November. They fired the assistant manager, who had been there 8 years, right before Christmas. I felt worse for her. She had kids. But yeah, I don't hold a grudge or anything. I needed it for a dose of reality. Up until that point I thought a loyal employee meant a loyal employer. I worked in a gas station in Chicago, making about $700 a week. I had 1 day off a month and I had to come in to do inventory on that day. I didn't mind all the hours because the pay was good. Anyways, I came down with an infection near my eye and went to the ER. The doctor told me I had to be admitted. Said I couldn't do that because I had to work. He told me best case I would just lose my eye, but more than likely the infection would go to my brain and I would die. So called work and let them know I was in the hospital. Spent 4 days there hooked to an IV that gave me 24 hours of antibiotics a day. Finally get out and go to work and get fired because of it. He told me it was because he needed someone for that shift and he really couldn't let them go after just hiring them. Company was too small to sue them over it. And to top it off he fought my unemployment claim. I lost my phone the night of my college's senior formal. That night, I got a call from my boss announcing an emergency meeting the following morning, which obviously I missed, and was immediately fired along with 2 of my colleagues. So stupid. The meeting was to review 5 new menu items. I got fired from my university sports center job as a pool lifeguard for posting on Facebook that I found drugs in a toilet there. The next day I had a phone call asking me to remove said status, and shortly afterwards, an email to inform me that my employment had been terminated on grounds of besmirching the university's good name. No joke, HR actually used the word besmirching. I would have been impressed if I wasn't so furious. The university is in the UK if anyone was wondering. I've heard that if you don't mention the name of the place where you work, they can't fire you. What I find stupid here is instead of trying to solve the drug problem, they try to cover it up instead. And then it wouldn't matter to you whether you posted it or not. I was once fired from a radio news director job for being, quote, a loose cannon. I never know what you're going to do next. This was in reference to news stories and when they aired. Guess I should have shown him my magic calendar that told me when and where news would happen. I was fired 2 years into a position I was really great at, for not wearing any makeup and answering the phone on 2 rings, not 1 ring, by the new store manager who was there for 1 week. The owner was furious at him but I refused to go back. I was fired for refusing to help my boss forge receipts for his tax audit. I had the best college job in the world, watching the library computer labs on campus. I had about 4 shifts of varying length every week, and I always showed up on time. Very rarely had someone cover, and I would pick up a shift every other week or so. There was a rather large automated system so my boss knew I was among the more reliable lab attendants, which he even admitted after firing me. Anyway, there is 1 meeting before the start of each semester, and if you didn't show up for that meeting you were fired. End of story. There was nothing important at the meeting. If you sent an email letting him know you were not back in school yet, he would not fire you. When you consider the meeting would last about 15 minutes and there was really nothing to cover, it's all very arbitrary. He just had to fire a few people to make his job look important. I sent an email saying I wouldn't be on campus yet, but he didn't receive it. He sent me an email at the start of the semester to let me know I was fired, which is kind of like breaking up with someone via Twitter. I replied asking to meet him in person, which he pretty much never did with any of us, except for the 1 meeting every semester. After going back and forth, I finally was able to meet him and I showed him the email I sent. He admitted that it was hard to fire me as I was a very reliable lab attendant and picked up shifts no one wanted. He would still probably have to fire me, using the excuse what do I say to the other 2 people I fired for the same reasons? What if they come up with an email? 2 I asked if I was still, in fact, fired, and he said, I'll have to think about it. I requested, very clearly, that at the very least he call me or have me come by his office to tell me I am fired. 3 days later he sent me another email saying I was still fired. Mainly, I was pissed that I was fired by email, and this guy, who was such a lazy, useless boss that he contacted me all of 0 times the year I worked in the labs, didn't even have the balls to fire me in person. I was subbing for an 8th grade history teacher once. He had about 4 periods of the same course and all I needed to do was play a PowerPoint which included a video and read the slides aloud to the students. Prior to the last class of the day, one of the students messed around with the computer and the PPT was no longer usable or I couldn't find it. I don't remember, I just know I was sole at that point. Luckily, the teacher had printed out the PPT slides for me and I'd remembered almost everything that was on the video. I'm also a good teacher and am pretty good with improv. I started delivering the information from memory and was pretty entertaining. but got a bit carried away with myself when I said, and then the king said, let's get those French bastards and war began or something to that effect. The important thing is that I said bastard. The next day the principal called me into his office and said some students reported me for saying the word bastard. I knew I'd made a mistake, but I hadn't used the term directed at a student. And never mind the fact that I improvised a lesson from memory and on the spot. Never mind the fact that the students were entertained and spent the whole of the lesson giving me their undivided attention and asking excellent follow-up questions. A sign of engaged learning. I was removed permanently as a sub for that school because of this one incident. I was and still am a very talented substitute, but I get into occasional trouble because students refuse to speak to me if they have an issue and instead choose to report me out of context to their principal. I truly hate my job because of the terrible imbalance of power both students and teachers hold over subs. I always feel like I'm about to lose my job no matter if I'm a very active, great sub or if I'm a lazy, passive sub. There is no victory. Kids are stupid. They probably did it just because they could. Little bastards. I was working at a gas station alone on the graveyard shift, which I think is a violation of some sort. I was in the cooler stocking beer when I heard the bell ring on the door. I walked out of the cooler and was met by two black guys with guns. They threatened my life and robbed the place. I called the cops immediately after they left. The cops show up. I give descriptions of the guys, the gun, etc. My info was spot on. The cops reviewed the video of the robbery and concluded that I was involved because I was too calm. Nobody reacts that well to having a gun in their face. They told that to the manager who fired a few days later. My co-worker told me I was fired due to the cops telling them I was involved. It made it into the paper and the cops totally fudged the descriptions of the robbers. I mean, it wasn't even close. They didn't even make an attempt to search for them the night of the robbery. Sounds like the cops were involved, indirectly or otherwise. My first aircraft maintenance job out of college, I was working for a guy running a small shop at a rural airport. He was quite a character. Hardest that had the highest expectations of me and the other employee and would get pee off if we took too long, in his opinion, to do something. For example, we got an aeroplane in for 100-hour inspection that was very obviously long overdue and our crap was completely neglected on the previous one. The spark plugs were so caked with lead that it took me an hour to clean them out. He got mad that it took longer than the typical half hour and wouldn't hear any of my excuses. He'd get mad at me for taking too long to cut open an oil filter, in spite of his shop being a complete mess and it taking me 10 minutes to find the filter cutter. Even he didn't know where it was. Despite these factors, he rarely did any work himself and set a bad example for us or downright fricked it up, but sat in the office allowing me, a completely green apprentice, and his other employee, a 4th-year apprentice, to work unsupervised, and would take our long coffee breaks. If the other employee or I would get up to head back to work before he was done his coffee, he'd tell us to sit and relax. Anyway, when my 3-month probationary period was ending, he called me into his office and started grilling me about random aircraft knowledge. Again, since I was fresh out of school and that was my first job, I had very little practical knowledge, and looking back now, half the crap he was asking was stuff even a 2 or 3-year journeyman would be unlikely to know. So of course, I didn't know the answers to a lot of the questions. He got pee off, as usual, and started ranting about the terrible quality of graduates the college was turning out and how he was going to phone them and complain. And then he sent me back to work saying that he had to think long and hard about whether he wanted to keep me on. I thought about it for the rest of the day and was pretty sure he was going to fire me. So the next morning I showed up. Soon as he arrived I told him I was quitting, packed up my tools and left. Got a better job a week later, at a reputable company that did things by the book, working supervised under a journeyman, and received absolutely glowing performance reviews and a good reference when I left for another job. I was a temp worker at a factory and I was walking past an air hose. The connector busted just as I passed it and it swung out and hit me in the head. It about knocked me out and I had a big gash on my forehead. I got a call while waiting in the doctor's waiting room to not come back and they did not need my help anymore. Granted, it was wrong that you were terminated for this, but a private Facebook post does not exist unless you send someone a private message. You shouldn't have been fired, but it was dumb to post that. Sorry. find out the one customer I'm friends with on FB. Dude, you were playing with fire. I was going to make a playing with fire joke, but I thought, this comment is buried so low on the chain that no one but you and I will know of it. I'm going to tell you a secret. I'm actually a sociopathic teenager who uses his powers of manipulation to charm girls into liking me and then uses their affection to benefit me personally. Also, I like impulsively on the internet. I worked at a farm-stand grocery store as a young teen. On my 14th birthday, my friend who was working the register gave me extra yogurt-covered pretzels, worth a total of $1.18, as a little something special in addition to the other things I was purchasing. I was fired, she was fired, and the bagger was fired for not reporting it. I can understand firing us, but the bagger? Really? I doubt she ever paid attention to any of the transactions in such detail. After graduating from university, I was hired on to do communications at a small transportation company, newsletters, website updates, etc. I was doing really well at that and seeing great results, so the president decided that naturally my skills could easily be transferred over to the operations department, which was totally failing and needed to be turned around. Long story short, he gave me a month to fix a department that had been performing poorly for 4 years, and then fired me when I wasn't able to fix it. Never mind the fact that I am in no way trained in or qualified for work in operations. Never mind the fact that I was still doing a great job at the stuff I'd been originally hired to do. 3 days before firing me, he told me I was a star at the company communications. And never mind the fact that it takes at least a month just to learn how a department functions, and then much more time to come up with the ideas for improving its processes. Ugh. Still makes me angry just thinking about it. You got set up. Sorry. I was working IT at a public university and got tasked with replacing some laptops in a few classrooms. I began the work during the 15-minute break between classes, but it took me longer than expected. The class comes in and the teacher demands to use the computer, but I explained I was still setting it up and it would be ready soon. I called my boss to get his advice, but he was in a meeting and didn't answer. Eventually I finished and left. They lost maybe 15 minutes of class time out of 75 minutes. The teacher reported me to the dean, my boss's boss, and said I was intentionally rude to her because she is black. I got fired for not being remorseful about the incident after justifying my actions. Couldn't file for wrongful termination since I was a student employee. My best friend and I worked at the same store. She asked me to let her know her schedule for Saturday, and I told her she was supposed to start at 9. I came in for 10. At some point, the schedule got changed, but no one mentioned it, and I was supposed to come in for 9, her for 10. Either way, the shift was covered, but they walked me out even though it was my first ever tardy in the week before. The manager had loved me. Turns out one of the assistants didn't like me, so lied and said I'd been late many times before. It was dumb on so many levels. My last job often had shift changes without informing people. Luckily my boss was pretty down to earth and knew I'd check my hours on a Monday as I'd often stop to chat. I worked as a laborer in a roofing factory, through a temp agency, for about 9 months in 2003, on third shift, 11 PM 7 AM. There were 4 of us operating a roofing roller, but only 3 positions to fill. So, everyone took turns. 30 minutes on position 1, 30 minutes on position 2, 30 minutes on position 3, 30-minute break, rinse, repeat. If you showed up at the roller last, you would inevitably have to take a 30-minute break as soon as you walked in. Realizing I could use this to my advantage, I intentionally started showing up first and taking position 1, so that my last 30-minute break would begin at 6:30 AM, and I could clock out and head home early. The non-temp workers, including several supervisors, knew what I was doing, and didn't see any problem with it. After several weeks of this, I go into the temp agency to pick up my paycheck. The lady at the front desk tells me that I have to talk to the boss man to get my check. So, I head back to his office and promptly get canned for costing the temp agency money. Suckers. I got fired for not doing someone else's job. Literally, I was launching a round of website changes. I was responsible for security and application testing, third-party integration testing and launching the site. I got fired because I didn't notice that one dude's part of the site copy wasn't correct, and I hadn't even been involved in that part of the site whatsoever. Frick those guys. Life has been much better not making crappy marketing websites. I got fired from a mom and pop video store because we were both trying to buy the store from the previous owner, and the landlord picked him over me only because every time the landlord came in looking for the previous owner, he came in the morning. I worked nights. He worked mornings. The previous owner was a deadbeat who hadn't paid rent in a year or so the landlord took over. He tried to be cool about it, saying he didn't need me anymore like he was doing me some kind of favor. I feel it's important to mention that he is legally blind and couldn't even drive himself to work. He had to hold everything right up to his face to even see what it was, and even then he still made mistakes on what movies were taken out. That place closed barely a year after that. I was sad to see it go, but I love that he failed miserably. This was about 2006-ish, before the fall of the video store. I like to believe I could have kept it alive for a few years, but who knows, maybe it's best I didn't buy it. An old job I worked at had several occurrences where someone was fired for a bull's reason. This one old guy who was a seasonal hire and your general really nice old guy. Well, one B of a woman said she felt uncomfortable around him and they fired him right after that. We had a point system where if you mess up on enough products we engraved on different items, you'll get a point, and once you get to 10 then they fired you. They always told you when you got a point. This one guy who had been working there for years and generally liked by everyone was fired after getting to 10 points without any warning that he was even getting points. I was once fired from a dollar store because I made change between two cash registers when we were really busy. Policy required that I take a big bill from one register back to the office and make change in the office. One of the cashiers, who wanted my job, told the store manager and I was fired. I told my on-duty manager at my last job he was an idiot for employing someone who lacked most major math skills for an accountant when he had someone with a degree in accounting who was willing to work for less already on staff. I used to do landscaping for about a year and a half as my previous job. My boss offered me commission finder fees for any jobs that his employees found him. One of my good friends needed a lot of work done around his family's house. I thought, perfect, I'll give this job to my boss and collect the $200 he had offered. The job was not a small job in the slightest. He had quoted them $4,000 to complete the work. Upon asking my boss about the finder's fee, he then gave me the runaround and stated that he can only give me $50. I thought about it for a minute and then said frick that noise. I called him the next day and told him my friend didn't want the work done anymore. I then told my friend that I would do the work on the weekend for $2,500. I went there on my day off, got the entire job done with my own tools. I hired my own crew, paid everyone well between $20 to $25 per hour. One of the people that I hired, a supposed friend, knew my boss and told him that I did the job. Boss fired me. I would have fired you too. You can't have your employees competing with you. I'm not saying he was right to try and screw you on the commission, but you had to expect his reaction would be to fire you. Not me, but one of my friends used to work for a national weight loss supplement company. She worked at one of their stores, selling natural weight loss kits to gullible rich customers. She worked for them for a little over a year and was one of their best employees. The week before she was fired, she was their employee of the week because she made the most commission that week. She was paid minimum wage, as well as commission for however many products she sold. During her last week, when some of her co-workers found out about her getting employee of the week, they spread nasty rumors about her to the boss, and unfortunately, her boss believed them. My friend was fired and was given a vague reason, along the lines of her performance not being up to standard. She was shocked to say the least, but in the end, she was glad to be out of that job. She said that many of her co-workers were catty and trying to one-up each other in sales. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video.